Last night the statue moved, and the sculptor's world would never be silent again. He woke before the light found the windows and knew the storm had gone. The house held that rinsed quiet that follows heavy rain. Pipes ticking as they cooled, a soft groan from the old spine of the roof, the distant sea back to its regular labor. He sat up, already reaching for the key he'd left on the nightstand, and felt the same tug through the chest that had woken him the last 2 nights. Not panic, a summons. He didn't bother with the kettle. Shirt, boots, key, hallway. The bucket under the leak was half full, but the drip had stopped, like the house had decided to keep its water for itself. He moved past it and unlocked the workshop. He knew before he stepped over the threshold that the room was warmer than it should be. Not stuffy. Living warm, like a kitchen that has just seen bread pulled from an oven. The air held a faint scent he'd spent 2 days trying to name. He had it now. Clean linen, orange peel, skin warmed by sleep. "Good morning," he said, but only in his head. Saying it aloud felt like asking too much before he'd earned it. The candles he'd left burned to low seas had finished the journey and gone to pale lakes of wax. The caged bulb was dark. Light came from the high window in a soft gray that showed dust dancing slow. He set the key on the bench and stood still. Her left hand had moved again. He saw it in the angle of the fingers, more curve, more readiness. The right hand, the one he'd left closed, had softened along the knuckles as if they'd learned air. The lips he'd shaped to part a breath's width had found another sliver. The throat looked less like stone stacked to suggest a passage and more like a passage that might carry sound. He stepped close, careful with his own breath, as if it would blur a line he couldn't redraw. He held his hand near her cheek and felt warmth gather and hold, not leaking away like sun from a wall, but collecting like water in a cupped palm. "I'm here." He didn't know if he was saying it to reassure her or himself. He washed his hands at the sink until the chill rolled the sleep from his bones, then dried them on the towel that had become permanent in its place on the peg. He set fresh candles at the corners and struck a match. Flame found wick and bowed in greeting. He didn't reach for the chisel. He listened. A sound moved through the room like a fingertip across parchment. Not the whisper of dust, not the tiny scrape of cooling metal. He felt it first at the back of his tongue, then in the bones under his eyes. He turned his head in the slow way you turn when you already know where to look. Her chest, beneath the shallow suggestion of cloth, rose and fell the slightest amount. Not with the regularity of sleep. The cautious test pattern of a system warming up. His throat went dry. He swallowed. He said her name, Miranda. The air in front of her lips shimmered, as if a flame lived there too small to see. "Say my name," he said. He hadn't planned to ask. The need arrived complete. Her mouth shaped it without sound, the way you practice a word before trusting it to air. The first attempt glanced off silence and left only the sensation of a note almost formed. The second gathered a breath and carried it just far enough. Elias. It came thin and human and real. It landed in him like a key turning. He closed his eyes because he had to, then opened them because not seeing would be worse. He took half a step closer, then stopped himself because forward was a kind of hunger, and hunger made bad decisions. "Are you in pain?" He hadn't meant to ask that either. It was the face, the tension no one would notice who hadn't carved it. He knew what effort looked like before effort admitted itself. A pause, then the smallest shake of her head. The movement was not a trick of light or imagination. It was movement. Stone thinking about muscle and deciding to try. He wanted to laugh in a sloppy, grateful way. He held it back for her dignity and for his. He nodded instead, small and steady. Good. Good. He made tea then, because hands needed work when a heart was sprinting. He boiled water on the little single burner near the sink, let the bag steep until the color went honest, and stood sipping and watching her. Not like a guard watches a door, but like a man watching a sunrise he's walked all night to reach. When the mug had cooled enough that he could hold it without feeling the edge, he set it down and came back to the block. He lifted the smallest chisel and the finest rifflers and laid them out as if for surgery. He spoke while he aligned them, not to fill silence, but to shape it. I think we finish the ears first, then the fine lines at the corners of the eyes, just suggestion, nothing that ages you. Then I'll work the throat again. And if the world keeps agreeing, we try for the shoulders. If I do too much, stop me. The candles made a small sound, a sound you would only hear if you'd spent a lot of time listening to small sounds. He took that as assent. He worked the ears with a care that felt like prayer, smoothing the inner curve where sound collects, giving it an honesty that would make future earrings unnecessary. He used the brush the way you brush hair out of a face. When he leaned close, her breath sketched warmth along his cheek. He didn't make a meal of that. He let it register and pass. He moved to the eyes. He didn't carve lashes. He adjusted planes so the light could pretend to be lashes when it wanted. He softened a corner by less than a thought and stepped back. Awareness deepened. It was the strangest thing he'd ever seen, and also the most sensible. As if all his years of learning had been a staircase to this landing. He ate nothing. He forgot to drink. The world beyond the high window sorted itself from gray to blue to white, then back toward afternoon. He fixed the loose slate properly this time, hammered it home with a patience the storm couldn't argue with, and came back to find the room holding its breath. "Say it again," he asked, even though he told himself he wouldn't ask. "Say my name." She did. The voice held more tone now, not just air. He could hear a shape in it that belonged to her, low, warm, with the way of people who don't waste words. He set his palm near her left hand and matched the curve the way he had the night before. The warmth there gathered and held as before, then pulsed once, steady. Her fingers moved. They did not flex like stone convincing itself it had permission. They flexed like flesh, testing a new truth. He placed his hand beneath hers, an invitation rather than a press. The weight that settled into his palm was almost nothing, the way a bird's weight is almost nothing, and yet the arm knows it. It lasted a count of 2, maybe 3. Enough. "Hi," he said, because anything larger would crowd the moment. She tried a smile. It tugged one corner of her mouth, then the other, like a person learning to drive a different road to the same house. The expression loosened something behind his ribs. He let his own answer without worrying if it made him look foolish. No one to witness but the one he wanted to see him. Her eyes, stone eyes, yes, but not, shifted a fraction to track him as he moved around the base. He made a sound then, a small, raw one, part laugh, part grief leaving. He didn't apologize for it. He went to the throat. He refined the hollow there, the place the pulse would announce itself, and the line where muscle runs when a person swallows. He worked so lightly he could almost hear hair questions itself on his forearm. He paused, and in that quiet he heard it. The faintest tick in air, timed to the rise and fall he'd first seen before dawn. Not an echo. A heartbeat. He looked at her and said nothing, because nothing was safe enough for a moment like that. Afternoon slid toward evening. The workshop collected its dusk. He lit only 2 candles this time and left the corners dark. The room took on the hush of a church after people have left, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of what just happened. "Are you tired?" He felt foolish for asking, then less foolish when she breathed, yes, without using the word. It wasn't just the human shape he was watching learn how to be. It was how a room cradles it. He set the tools aside. He washed his hands slow, dried them, and stood where he could see her face without leaning. "I'm going to try something. If it's wrong, stop me." He lifted his right hand and laid it, finally, against her cheek. Warmth came up into his palm, real and alive, and he felt the slight give of skin over bone. Not much. Enough to make the world flip and settle into a truer orientation. He let his hand rest there. He didn't stroke. He didn't press. He learned her temperature, the way you learn the temperature of a room you plan to stay in. Her eyes, light-gathered, angled, seemed to find focus through him and then on him. He saw his reflection in them in a way that wasn't reflective at all. Recognition moved through her features like a tide that has decided, after long standing still, to come in. "You found me." He didn't know if she had spoken the sentence aloud or if the air itself had given it to him. He answered anyway. "I did." He slid his thumb an inch, the softest pass along the line where the cheek begins to hollow. Under it, muscle tightened in reflex. His breath left him with a sound he wouldn't try to name. He took her left hand in both of his. The fingers lay there first, warm and heavy and learning. Then they tightened. The pressure was gentle, then firmer. He thought of all the hands he'd drawn and carved and studied, and how all along they'd been a study for this one. "Do you want to sit?" He smiled at himself for asking a statue if she wanted to sit. He was not talking to a statue anymore. He stepped back and looked at the way he'd set the hips and the fall of the carved cloth, at the flex he'd hinted in the right foot, at the center of gravity he'd calculated in 100 small choices. He put his hand at her elbow as if to steady a person learning the feel of weight. The first movement was nothing, almost, and then the smallest shift toward forward that made every muscle he owned brace. The second movement followed the line he'd hoped his work would make possible. The right knee unlocked. The left foot found more floor. The carved cloth learned what fabric learns when it brooms over a shin. The bench took a new complaint of weight and held. He breathed again because he hadn't been. She sat. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't awkward. It was new. He wanted to applaud and didn't. He wanted to cry and didn't do that either. He did what was useful, moved the stool within reach, adjusted the candle so the flame didn't glare into her eyes, checked the base to be sure his pride hadn't built a trap. He crouched so they were eye level. He was close enough to notice the single freckle he'd never put there, where the curve of cheek meets the sweep toward the ear. He smiled because the world had gone to this much trouble to tell him she was real. Thirsty! He realized, as he said it, that he had no idea how this would work, then realized that not knowing didn't matter. He wet the linen in clean water and wrung it out so it would not drip. He held it to her lips. She pressed there with the careful curiosity of someone who has been given a tool and is learning its name. The cloth came away darker. He repeated it. She breathed out, and the breath carried warmth and the faintest salt of human. "Thank you. You're welcome." He sat on the stool and let his hands hang. The tremor that had been hiding in them came forward and shivered itself out. He watched her watch him. He didn't need words to know the shape of what lived between them. It had been there before chisel met stone. "What am I?" He didn't flinch. He'd expected the question, though not in those words. He answered the only way that felt true. Alive. Her brow creased, then smoothed. The line of her mouth changed, thinking, accepting, then choosing. She looked past him to the high window, and the square of evening caught there. Her gaze came back. In it, an animal brightness, alert, tender, unafraid. "Who are you when you're not here?" The question had weight. He sat with it. He thought of the deliveries and the invoices and the phone he'd shoved under a rag. He thought of the rooms in the manor he didn't use because they felt like other people's endings. He thought of the quiet and how it had kept him because he hadn't known how to leave it without lying to himself. "I'm the man who came here to work and forgot to live. I'm the man who dreamed you and learned that the dream wasn't fiction. I'm Elias." She nodded, small, like a bird dipping its head to water. She lifted their joined hands, and the motion was clean now, not tentative. the warmth of her skin braided with his and made a third heat he hadn't known existed. "Will I stay?" He had promised himself he wouldn't lie. He looked at her and let awe and fear and hope sit side by side without one swallowing the others. "Yes, if we're careful, if we listen, if we don't rush what wants time." She looked at their hands, then at him. Then she did the smallest, bravest thing he'd ever seen. She leaned forward into her own weight and rested her forehead against his. The contact was a lit match touched to tinder that has waited years. Heat moved through him in a way that had nothing to do with lust and everything to do with relief, finding a home. His hands rose of their own accord and framed her face, bone under skin, skin under warmth. He felt the gentle tremor of new muscle waking and supported it with his steadiness. He kissed her the way you drink water after crossing a dry place. Not a claim, a thank you. Her breath met his. The world didn't tilt or sing or shower them with metaphors. It did the simpler, better thing. It felt right. Her heartbeat found a rhythm. He felt it under his thumbs where the face meets the ear. It was human fast, then slowed, then set itself. He took that sound into himself and held it. He pulled back just far enough to see her eyes. Even in candlelight they were brown, true, and deep. The red of her hair caught flame from the wick and held it in small threads like metal warming. "Welcome," he said. Her smile completed itself. Not practice now, not rehearsal. The real thing. "Hello." They stayed like that a while, no rush, no need to narrate, while evening finished writing itself on the window. He guided her to stand again, not because he wanted to test her, but because he wanted the room to learn the shape of her moving through it. She rose smoother this time. The bench accepted the subtraction of weight with less complaint. The floor took her where it should. He led her 2 steps, then 3, hands a light brace at her waist. She looked down at her feet as if surprised to find them hers. When she lifted her head, the astonishment broke into laughter, quiet and clean. He laughed with her because the sound left him no choice. "That's enough for tonight," he said, softer than the words read. He could see the tremble back at the edges of her shoulders, the good kind that means muscles have done honest work. "Stay," she said, and he heard the word not as a plea but as a plan. "I'm not going anywhere." He settled her back on the bench and drew the thin blanket over the base to keep the night air from cooling stone that didn't need it anymore, but might remember it. He laid his palm once more along her cheek because good habits deserved repeating. She leaned into it in a way that would slow any man with sense. He took his hand away gently, because leaving well is how you get to come back well. He put out one candle and left the other burning. The room looked good in that light, honest, worked, full of what it had seen. He moved to the door and turned, because turning away without looking would feel like quitting on a promise. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she said, and the word held. He locked the door and felt the pressure on the back of his hand again, the same touch signed in air that had followed him last night. It didn't make him ache this time. It steadied him like a hand at his back when you step onto a dark stair. He slept, not like a man on watch, like a man home. Outside, the sea practiced its old song for the cliffs. Inside the workshop, 2 small flames burned, one on a wick and one behind a pair of brown eyes that would be fully hers when the sun came back. The days after the storm fell into a rhythm neither of them planned. Elias woke before dawn out of habit. For the first time in years, he didn't dread the light. He'd pad barefoot down the hall, unlock the workshop, and find Miranda exactly where he'd left her. Only she was never quite the same. Each morning, she held a little more color, a little more movement. The change no longer startled him. It filled him. The first time he saw her sleeping, really sleeping, it undid him. She'd curled beneath the thin blanket on the bench, head pillowed on her arm. No marble sheen, no statue's stillness, just the slow rise and fall of breath. He stood there in the quiet, until she opened her eyes, brown and clear, and smiled. "You stayed," she murmured. He smiled back. "You told me to." They learned each other in small, human ways. She wanted to know what rain felt like beyond the window. He took her outside during the first drizzle and watched her tilt her face to the sky, laughing when drops ran down her hair. Her joy was so pure it hurt. When she reached to take his hand, the warmth of her palm erased every lonely year behind him. Inside, she explored the house room by room, as if reclaiming it from shadow. He found her tracing her fingers over books, fabrics, walls. Sometimes she asked what things were, sometimes she just listened, the way someone listens to music they once loved, but only half remember. He taught her words: table, window, stove, and she repeated them softly, rolling sound into meaning. Her voice deepened with use. It grew confident, lived in. At night, she liked candlelight best. She said it made the world gentler. He'd light a few in the corner and they'd sit by the workshop window, watching the surf glint beneath the moon. Sometimes they spoke. More often, they didn't need to. One evening, weeks later, she found him cleaning tools he no longer used. He still sculpted a little. Habit, mostly, but not people, never faces. "You don't carve anymore," she said. He turned the chisel in his hand, the metal dull with disuse. "I don't need to." "Because of me?" He shook his head. "Because you taught me what it was for." She crossed to him, her hair aflame in the low light. "Then keep one," she said, pointing to a small piece of marble on the bench. "For memory." He did. Together they shaped it into something abstract, a simple curve that caught light and threw it back warm. When it was finished, she placed her hand over his. "Now it's both of us," she said. That night, he dreamed differently. No more fog, no reaching across distance. He dreamed of hands tangled in sunlight, of laughter in the yard, of color where the world had been gray. When he woke, the scent of her hair was on his pillow, and the sound of her humming drifted from the kitchen. He found her there barefoot, hair unbound, making tea. Steam rose around her like the breath of the sea. The way she moved, careful, curious, alive, was still miraculous, but no longer strange. She turned when she heard him and smiled like sunrise. "Tea?" she asked. He stepped close enough to touch her waist. "Every morning, if you'll make it." She handed him a cup. When their fingers brushed, the pulse between them steadied into something ordinary and perfect. He realized then that ordinary was the most beautiful word he'd ever known. Later, they walked the cliffs. The wind played through her hair, gulls cut white lines across the sky. She looked back at the manor, the window where the candles had burned that first night. "Do you think I'll ever remember before?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe it doesn't matter." She nodded slowly. "Then I'll remember now." They stood together at the edge, the sea breathing below them. Her hand found his, fitting easily. He thought of the block of marble he'd once believed was a monument to loneliness and felt it fade from memory, leaving only the woman beside him, the proof that creation could turn into life and life into love. That evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, they returned to the workshop one last time. Only one candle burned. The room smelled of salt and wax and warmth. On the bench sat the empty stone shell, her old form, hollowed by the miracle that had replaced it. Miranda touched it gently, eyes soft with something like gratitude. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. He shook his head. "I'd rather touch you." She smiled, tracing her fingers along the cold marble until they found his. Then she whispered, "Keep it. It's where we began." He nodded. They turned out the candle together. They slept in the room upstairs that night with the windows open to the sea. The air was full of salt and promise. Sometime before dawn, he woke to her breathing against his shoulder, steady and human. He lay still, listening to the heartbeat that had once belonged to stone, and thought, this is what forever sounds like. When light finally touched the horizon, he whispered to her, "You're home." She stirred, eyes half open, smiling into his chest. "I know." Outside, waves crashed, steady as a sculptor's rhythm. Inside, two lives breathed in time, and the world held its shape. Morning light spilled through the open windows, scattering across the studio's dust-soft floor. The chisel still rested on the bench where he'd left it, its edge dulled with peace. Outside, gulls wheeled over a calm, endless sea. Elias turned to find Miranda standing by the doorway, hair alive with sun, her smile gentle and sure. She reached for his hand, and when their fingers intertwined, he felt her pulse echo his own. 2 heartbeats where once there had been none. He kissed her brow, and the sea wind carried their laughter through the house that had once been hollow. And somewhere in the light, the old marble figure glimmered, no longer cold, only radiant, its surface warmed by the life it had given back. If you like this story, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps this channel grow. Thanks for watching.